Olympias, executed in 316 BCE. The mother of Alexander the Great, Olympias is one of the most famous women from antiquity. Due to the hostility toward her that we see in the sources, it is hard to assess Olympias fairly. Ambitious women who were politically active were generally seen as evil and hubristic by the standards of ancient thought, and this might account for a considerable amount of the hostility that we see directed toward her by our sources. Her Epirot heritage and involvement in the politics of two northern kingdoms also excited the prejudice of Greek writers from mainland Greece, who blamed Olympias and her family for the loss of their political autonomy. Uncritical readings of the ancient sources by previous popular and scholarly writers have produced an image of Olympias as a master conspirator and murderess. While these source biases are something that we have to keep in mind when looking at any ancient woman, there is also considerable evidence that Olympias was a vicious person even by the extremely low moral standards of her own day. Before we get into Olympias' life, however, I would like to address the issue of religion first, since Olympias is often unfairly portrayed as a snake-handling fanatic. In Oliver Stone's Alexander movie, Olympias is portrayed as a kind of religious fanatic who played with snakes all day. This idea of Olympias is the result of a combination of Greek smears about her northern, semi-barbarian, in their eyes, heritage, and modern misunderstandings about the religious norms of the Greek world. The ethnopolitics of Greek writers contemporary with Philip and Alexander involved arguing against counting the Macedonians as Greeks at a time when the Macedonians were advancing their claim to Greekness to bolster their acceptance as the overlords of the Greek world. There were some differences in mythology and ritual between each Greek polis, and the differences became slightly larger in frontier areas like Epirus. When we hear of Olympias leading women in wild rituals, we should not forget that even in Athens, the capital of philosophy and reason, there was a celebration which saw young maidens run through the woods nude, hunting and killing rabbits with their bare hands. Further, although men dominated war and politics, positions of religious authority were almost entirely dominated by women. Aristocratic and royal women were responsible for leading other women in important rituals to appease the gods, and they were generally entrusted with interpreting the will of the gods. Whatever reservations Greeks and Macedonians had about women being involved in politics, they entrusted them with the management of human relations with the gods, which in their worldview determined which states prospered and which states failed. In other words, if Olympias was playing with snakes, then she was most likely simply doing her duty to her kingdom and not engaging in anything untoward or inappropriate. Olympias was the third of four names used by the woman best known for giving birth to Alexander the Great. Born as Polyxena in 375 BCE, Olympias was the daughter of Neoptolemus I, who ruled Epirus as king between 370 and 360 BCE. At the time of her birth, Epirus was called Molossia, and in fact would not be referred to as Epirus until about 330 or so. A member of the Aeacidae dynasty of Molossia, Olympias remained close to her birth family for her entire life, and was at the center of Epirot political power until very late in her life. When her father died, Polyxena's uncle Erymbus took power. In 358, Erymbus arranged a marriage between his niece and the new king of Macedon, Philip II. This move was an important step forward for both Molossia, which was a new and underdeveloped kingdom, and for Philip's Macedon, which was a state with a lot of potential power, but which was prone to foreign invasions and civil war. Philip supposedly met and fell in love with the Molossian princess at a religious festival on Samothrace, which may account for why he chose to marry the reigning king's niece rather than one of his daughters. Just before being married to Philip, Polyxena's name changed to Myrtale. The wedding took place in 357. The couple conceived their first child shortly after the wedding. In 356 BCE, Philip's horses were victorious at the Olympic Games, which led Myrtale to change her name to the more familiar Olympias in honor of her husband's achievement. Later that summer, Olympias gave birth to Alexander, the first son of Philip II. The night before she had consummated her marriage with Philip, Olympias had a dream that her womb had been struck by a lightning bolt. After the marriage, Philip had a dream where he had placed a seal on her womb with the emblem of a lion. While Philip's dream may very well have been inspired by late-night sessions of the original Resident Evil, Both dreams are almost certainly romantic fantasies woven into the story of Alexander the Great to make his later greatness a divine destiny. Olympius supposedly told Alexander that Zeus was his real father, although this may very well have been Olympius's way of encouraging Alexander to exceed the deeds of his increasingly great father. Philip and Olympius also had a daughter named Cleopatra a year or two after Alexander's birth. Olympius seems to have been very close to Alexander and may have enjoyed a similar relationship with Cleopatra. The trouble between Olympias and her husband Philip II, about which so much ink has been spilt, seems to center around Philip's use of diplomatic marriages to achieve his geopolitical objectives. Kings of Macedon could practice polygamy, and that is precisely what Philip did. The real problem was that Philip was having children with these other wives, and some of them could grow up to inherit the throne, a position that Olympius felt rightfully belonged to Alexander. Knowing full well that Macedonians were xenophobic about even close relatives like the Epirotes, Olympius may have impressed upon Alexander the danger that a half-sibling of full Macedonian blood could pose if that child were to reach adulthood and become a contender for the throne when Philip died. When Olympias left Philip's court in a huff after losing her favorite court, Alexander accompanied her to Epirus, despite the fact that he was the heir apparent. Civil war over the throne was a time-honored Macedonian tradition, and Olympias was trying to recruit her younger brother, now the king of Epirus, to fight Philip, but Philip was able to keep the peace. Cleopatra stayed behind at Pella during this split. Philip II and Alexander of Epirus agreed that the two kingdoms would deepen their ties by having Cleopatra marry her uncle. Alexander of Macedon returned to his father's side, while Olympias remained behind in Epirus. In 336 BCE, Philip II presided over the wedding of Cleopatra and his brother-in-law, now son-in-law, Alexander of Epirus. During the celebrations, he was assassinated by Pausanias, a young man who had been sexually abused by Attalus, a prominent Macedonian, and Philip's new father-in-law. In the ensuing melee, Alexander was able to secure the throne quickly. Olympius insisted that Alexander eliminate his uncle, the deposed king Amyntas IV, and also wipe out Attalus's family, especially since Philip had married his daughter and had given birth to a young child. While these moves were brutal, Olympius's advice was quite rational. There were few Argead rivals to choose from after Olympius was done, although this would prove to be a double-edged sword when Alexander ended up dying young. Due to Olympias's feud with Philip and her ruthlessness, many ancient and modern writers believe that Olympius was the architect of Philip's assassination. However, while this cannot be completely ruled out, it is highly unlikely. First, Philip was assassinated for failing to address the grievance of an aristocrat and thereby dishonoring him, and this was completely in keeping with Macedonian tradition. Second, while Olympias was a plotter and a schemer, she was not in the same league as her estranged husband when it came to being able to coordinate events. Third, if Olympias was involved in the plot, then it is most likely that Alexander was also involved, and in that case Alexander would have been the primary architect and executioner of the plan. Note that Olympias was in Epirus at the time of the wedding. Furthermore, it was Alexander and not Olympius who had nearly gotten into a brawl with Attalus at a banquet when Attalus toasted Philip and prayed for a legitimate heir to the throne. However, by the time of the wedding at Pella, Alexander and his father were back on good terms, and Philip was planning on utilizing his young and talented son in his invasion of Persia, so Alexander's future still looked bright and secure. The best explanation for Philip's death is that he was assassinated by a rogue, aggrieved bodyguard who was butthurt in more ways than one. When Philip's death corresponded with the wishes of Olympius and worked out in Alexander's interest, this does not necessarily mean that either of them had the clout or resources to engineer the demise of a man who was a living legend among the vast majority of his subjects by the time of his death. By 334 BCE, Alexander III of Macedon had humbled his local enemies who had dared to cross him, and he had embarked on the invasion of the Persian Empire that his father had planned. Alexander left Antipater behind as regent in Macedon, with his mother also resuming her residence in Pella. Throughout the campaign, the regent and queen mother butted heads as Olympias attempted to assert herself, and Antipater jealously guarded his prerogatives. Both wrote letters condemning the other to Alexander, and he never seems to have taken a side, being aware that he needed the experienced Antipater to hold down the fort, and also not wanting to alienate his mother. Finally, Olympias became sufficiently exasperated with Antipater that she withdrew to her homeland of Epirus to live with her recently widowed daughter Cleopatra and her young children. When Olympias's brother and son-in-law Alexander I of Epirus died, he was succeeded by Aeacides, who was still a minor at the time. Olympias was chosen as the regent for Aeacides until he achieved manhood, and she began to fill this role immediately upon her arrival in 330 BCE. In Epirus, unlike in Macedon, it was acceptable for women to exercise political power. In fact, while Alexander I was away in Italy, Cleopatra had served as regent. The differences in Epirot and Macedonian political norms may account for why Olympias had so many difficulties getting along with Macedonian men, as neither Olympias nor Macedonians, like Antipater, were willing to yield any ground. In the summer of 323 BCE, Olympias received news from Babylon that her world-conquering son had died. Her grief at his passing must have been great, since the two of them had been close and had exchanged considerable correspondence since his departure some 11 years before. Some modern scholars think that Olympias was the source of the story that Antipater's sons, Cassandra and Iolaus, had poisoned Alexander in order to prevent their father from being replaced in Macedon. The story goes that Cassandra arrived with some kind of secret poison and gave it to Iolaus, Alexander's cupbearer. It is quite possible that Olympias suspected her old political foe of foul play, and/or that she accused him of this deed simply to discredit him. In Babylon, the only heirs to Alexander's throne were fundamentally unviable. The army assembly under Perdiccas had agreed to put a crown on the developmentally disabled Aridaeus, who was now King Philip III, and Alexander's infant son by his Bactrian wife Roxanne was also crowned as Alexander IV. For Olympias and her daughter Cleopatra, this meant that the survival of the Argead house was on the line. Scholars looking at Olympias's actions during this time typically make two assumptions. One, Olympias was behind the plan to have Cleopatra marry a high-ranking successor in order to get back into the center of the political arena. And two, Olympias's plan all along was to protect and raise her grandson Alexander IV until such time as he could rule the empire that his father had built. While this is not an unreasonable take on Olympias, it should not be regarded as bulletproof. First, there is no reason to think that Cleopatra wasn't an equal partner in this enterprise, and she would hardly need to be a political genius to figure out her value on the marriage market as a fertile, full sister of Alexander. Second, if Cleopatra were to marry one of the successors and have a son by that person, then this grandchild of Olympias would be much more likely to succeed to the Macedonian throne than Alexander IV by simple virtue of having very powerful living parents. As someone who excelled in cutthroat court politics, Olympias must have been fully aware that even if her plan succeeded, that Alexander IV would most likely be cast aside if Cleopatra were to bear a son to someone like Leonidas or Perdiccas. Further, Olympias did not actually meet Alexander IV or his Bactrian mother until the child king was already 5 years old, and by that point it was clear that he was a healthy child, infant mortality in antiquity was very high, and Cleopatra was unlikely to escape Sardis before her waning days of fertility were over. While what limited evidence we have does not paint the Epirotes as being quite as ethnocentric as their Macedonian cousins, we also cannot know what Olympias thought about her grandson's maternal heritage. Based on the probable long-term consequences if Cleopatra were to succeed in finding a successor husband and bearing a son, I think that it is more likely than not that Olympias' original intention was not to guide Alexander IV to supreme power, but rather to set up another grandson by Cleopatra. Regardless of whether mother or daughter or both drew up the plan for Cleopatra to marry a successor, the plan failed. Leonidas died in action after agreeing to marry Cleopatra. Perdiccas was interested in marrying Cleopatra and making a play for increased power, but he dithered. Both of them got cold feet, and then he was killed. By 320, Cleopatra was a prisoner in Sardis, and although Olympias did not and could not know it, she would never again see her daughter. Olympias watched her daughter's prospect interests fall apart from Epirus. By the end of 320 BCE, when Antipater returned to Macedon, he brought the two kings and their courts with him. Due to the state of her relationship with Antipater, Olympias was unable to visit her grandson. In 319, Olympias must have rejoiced at the death of her bitter foe, Antipater. After an uneasy peace between Antipater's successor Polyperchon and his son Cassander broke down, a civil war between the two of them broke out over control of both Macedon and the two kings. Polyperchon, having been Antipater's choice and having a better and longer resume than his challenger, found himself unable to finish off Cassander, who proved to be a better general than Polyperchon had expected. Both contenders began to seek out allies and props for their regime. Polyperchon was the guardian of the two kings, and he knew that having Olympias on his side would be a major coup. Olympias received Polyperchon and Epirus, and the two negotiated her return as the guardian of Alexander IV. So far as we can tell, this was the first ever meeting between Olympias and her grandson. It is only at this point that it became incontrovertible that Olympias was planning to do whatever it took to set up her grandson for supreme power. Polyperchon must have been fairly hard-pressed, or else Olympias was an excellent negotiator. Based on later events, it appears that Olympias came back to Macedon with the understanding that she would exercise real power. In fact, in the events of 317 to 316, it seems that Olympias was calling the shots, and Polyperchon was more or less along for the ride. Back in Macedon, Philip III's wife Adia, a young woman with every bit as much grit and determination as Olympias, made a pact with Cassander. What had been little more than Cassander fighting to gain his father's old position had now evolved into a full-blown royal civil war to determine whether Alexander's great empire would officially be ruled by a 5-year-old or someone who was developmentally disabled. Olympias returned to Macedon escorted by Polyperchon and the Epirot army under her cousin, Iosides. Adia had rallied the Macedonian army that Polyperchon had left behind in Macedon behind her leadership, and she was forced to lead in person due to the lack of generals on the scene. Cassander had promised to hurry north, but he was bogged down besieging the city in Greece, and he was not going to be present. Militarily, the advantage lay with Adia's Macedonian army. However, Olympias rode in front of the Epirot force, and the Macedonians were filled with awe at the sight of Alexander's mother. They immediately laid down their arms. Philip III and Adia were captured and imprisoned at Pydna. For Olympias, this victory was a kind of validation after so many years of dreaming of setting things right in Macedon. To commemorate her victory over Adia, Olympias changed her name to Stratonike, which literally translates to victorious army. Now a military genius to rival her famous son, at least in her own mind, Olympias began to make moves to consolidate her power. Olympias's agents hunted down and killed prominent supporters of Adia and Philip III. Olympias now officially declared that Antipater's sons Iolaus and Cassander had been responsible for Alexander's death at Babylon, and so, to retaliate, she had the ashes of Iolaus and Nicanor removed from their graves and scattered to erase their memory. If Cassander had not shared his father's hatred of Olympias before, this act ensured that he would not rest until she was brought to heel. Given Olympias's efficiency when it came to purges, it is likely that her moves had left the army in Macedon free of anyone who had any major grievances with her. Alexander's former mistress Barsine and illegitimate son Heracles fled from Europe to Asia Minor at this time to escape Olympias's wrath. To prepare for the coming showdown with Cassander, Olympias also used her cachet to lure Alexander's retired bodyguard Aristobulus to her banner. She tried to attract the services of Eumenes, but he elected to stay in Asia. Olympias or Polyperchon also negotiated an alliance with the Aetolian League, an increasingly powerful coalition of northern Greek poleis, with the understanding that they would impede Cassander's attempts to return to Macedon. In December of 317, with most of their former supporters having been liquidated, Olympias thought that the time was ripe to eliminate Adia and Philip III. However, this would prove to be a massive overreach. While she was pulling off her purge, Olympias had ordered the royal couple to be imprisoned under harsh conditions, unbefitting royalty, and Adia's jailers were talking to others about how harsh the conditions were at the makeshift prison. The combination of the purge and rumors about how badly one of their kings was being treated caused some uneasiness among the Macedonians. When Olympias had Philip III executed and then ordered Adia to commit suicide, she thought that she had ensured the rise of Alexander IV by eliminating his biggest potential rivals. Had Cassander and his army not been lurking in Greece, Olympias might just have succeeded once the resentment subsided. Once Cassander concluded his affairs in Greece, he began to march on Macedon. To stop his three-pronged advance, Olympias divided her forces into three. She retained a sizable force at Pydna, Polyperchon had a large army, and Aristobulus had a small force in the heart of Macedon. For whatever reason, possibly because morale was low after the execution of two Argiads and she feared defections, Olympias withdrew her army into the walls of Pydna very early on. For whatever reason, Olympias did not take the time to provision the city, so her troops began to starve almost immediately. Olympias could only live up to the name Stratonike once, and that was before she had even adopted the name. As her troops went hungry and began to fall ill or desert, Olympias looked at her options. She seems to have been plotting some sort of escape by sea. It is unclear where she was hoping to go, since abandoning an army would undermine her prestige to a point that might well prove fatal. However, it is likely that her hope was to escape to Aristobulus' stronghold at Amphipolis, another port city. The major obstacle to Olympias making an escape was that Cassander quickly blockaded the city and made communication with Polyperchon and Aristobulus difficult. Intercepting a letter from Polyperchon, Cassander reused the seal to send a fake letter to Olympias and gave her a time and date when a rescue boat would be present. Rather than attempting to catch her, Cassander was toying with her in order to break her spirit and make her submit. After she returned from the fake rendezvous, Olympias assumed the worst about Polyperchon, either that he was dead or had even defected, and she lost hope. Shortly thereafter, her starving soldiers approached her and asked for her permission to surrender. She granted them this mercy, since she could see no path forward to victory. Despite swearing an oath that he would not harm Olympias' person, Cassander had no intention of allowing her to live after the grave insult that she had inflicted on his deceased brothers. Knowing that killing Argiads was a legitimacy killer, as it had undermined even Olympias, Cassander instead arranged for Olympias to be put on trial in front of the army. To increase the odds of a death sentence for the troublesome queen, Cassander mandated that Olympias not be allowed to speak, and that the assembly would only hear from the families of the victims of Olympias' recent purge. While this was clearly a show trial, it seems to have been regarded as legitimate and fair at the time. Despite putting Olympias' fate in the hands of a hostile audience, as the trial dragged on, Cassander knew that the assembly was wavering on whether or not they could actually go through with executing the mother of Alexander the Great. Cassander tried to lure Olympias into making an escape attempt so that he could arrange for her death in a legitimate way, but Olympias was too cagey to fall for that trick. In the end, however, the one-sided nature of the trial and the large number of purge victims proved too much for even the mother of Alexander to win a favorable verdict. After the conviction, it was time to implement the sentence of execution. While this may sound easy, since the sentence was to be carried out by the men who had just voted for it, in practice this proved to be Olympias' last act of defiance to the house of Antipater. When she presented herself to her would-be executioners, she was dressed in her full regal regalia, thus presenting a formidable and familiar image, which awed and deterred most of the men from acting. Cassander eventually did find willing executioners, but it took some doing. Justin says that Cassander had to hire hardened killers to carry out the sentence, while Diodorus says that she was turned over to the families of her victims, with the implication being that they probably tortured her in unspeakable ways. Another source says that she was going to be stoned to death, which is fairly plausible since it would allow her killers to avoid getting her blood on their hands. At the time of her death, Olympias was about 59 years old. Whatever else we may say about Olympias, she was a dedicated mother and grandmother. As with Cersei from Game of Thrones, this does not make Olympias a nice or even decent person. However, she was more complex than any villain of fiction ever could be, and there were circumstances which put her in a position to shine in the worst way possible. To recapitulate some of my earlier points, Olympias was a politically active Epirot woman in a Macedonian world where women were expected to play a secondary role, and then only if they were Macedonian princesses in the proper sense. Olympias's desire to ensure the succession of her child and grandchild forced her to commit atrocious acts and to butt heads with prominent and beloved figures. Modern misunderstandings of Greek religious norms and lack of awareness of literary tropes about ambitious women have also made Olympias seem more unstable than she really was. Olympias's biggest flaw is that she was prone to overreach, and she didn't know or simply didn't care about how others would perceive and react to her actions. Make no mistake about it, Olympias was as much a viper as the snakes that she supposedly kept in her bed. However, if you have learned anything from this series at all, you should know that the world that Olympias inhabited was a giant viper pit stretching over parts of 3 different continents.